Welcome back to the deep dive. Tonight we're doing something highly unusual. Our source material is, well, it's unconventional, to say the least. We're diving into a series of written statements, emails, voice transcripts sent over months from a single individual, and this person claims to be a siren merman hybrid. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like fiction, and you'd be right to be skeptical, but our mission here isn't to verify facts. Not really. We're treating this as an intense, cohesive narrative, an unsettling story that feels almost engineered to raise certain profound questions. We're analyzing the psychological, the metaphorical frameworks it uses to talk about myth, consequence, and the nature of civilization itself.
And that framework is absolutely key. Our job is to sit with the discomfort of these claims rather than just dismissing them out of hand. We have to ask why. Why do stories like this keep resurfacing? Why do they resonate so strongly across cultures? And why is the deep ocean the one setting we're least confident in dismissing when it comes to the unknown? This narrative, it challenges our fundamental assumptions about what history even is, about what intelligence looks like when it adapts to an environment that's completely alien to us.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the core claims about his identity. This person claimed to be born between two worlds, but raised largely among humans. And he was always aware that his body responded differently to things we take for granted: water, pressure, sound.
Yeah, and the source describes the ocean not as this chaotic void, but as something highly structured. It operates on sensory rules that our surface senses they just can't detect.
And that's fascinating, the detail about perception. The claim is that below a certain depth, light just becomes irrelevant. It's not the primary source of data anymore.
Right. Everything shifts. It shifts entirely to sound, pressure, and time. I mean, if you think about it, sound travels, what, 5 times faster in water than in air? Pressure is constant. It's powerful data. And time. In the deep, time is measured in geological epochs, not in our little human years.
He says what we call darkness is just. It's a point where our human senses fail. We look into the abyss and see nothing. But the environment is actually screaming with information they can process.
Precisely. And that redefines these creatures of the deep. They're not magical sea monsters. They're environmental adapters. Their bodies are fine-tuned to process those specific data streams. Their intelligence, if it exists, it's measured by its capacity for patience, for pressure tolerance.
And their role, he claims, isn't to rule the waves or, protect sunken ships. They're observers. Merfolk are witnesses. They watch for massive imbalance, for disruptions, usually caused by the noise and arrogance of the surface world. They intervene rarely and only out of necessity. He frames it as a kind of detached environmental maintenance, never kindness.
Which brings us to the most compelling part of this whole internal narrative, the siren aspect. The claim is that sirens don't sing, not in the way we think of it. They resonate. Their vocalizations are highly focused, powerful vibrations. They don't use music to compel action. They use specific sonic frequencies to influence neurological activity.
Wait. So they're not singing to hypnotize sailors with a beautiful song. They're accidentally triggering panic or compulsion just by being near us, like a structural frequency that makes a building shake. That is a fundamentally different and, wow, a far more unsettling kind of monster.
It shifts the entire dynamic from enchantment to physics, doesn't it? The alleged hybrid describes his own voice as dangerous, capable of causing panic, disorientation, and intense compulsion in humans, without any intent on his part. It's a description of their basic existence just being disruptive to ours.
And that connects right to this other detail we found, the self-imposed restraint as survival. He describes being terrified of his own natural abilities, having to consciously moderate them. The source suggests that modern surface noise shipping, sonar, seismic testing, it's so overwhelming that many siren-like beings have retreated permanently into the deepest parts of the ocean.
They seek refuge. Not in palaces or cities, but in a state he calls awareness and presence, something shaped by extreme pressure and infinite patience. And this raises a crucial point. What if we're mistaking consequence for malice? If these beings interact purely through vibration and resonance, then our intrusion, our constant racket, it would disrupt their world. The chaos that results in humans would be a side effect of that disruption, not some hostile, planned attack.
But isn't noticing essentially a form of surveillance? And if the consequence of their presence is human chaos, at what point does observation stop being passive? When does it become a hostile act, at least from our perspective? He seems to imply that the deep doesn't hate us, it just notices us. But he also warns that being noticed is the most dangerous stage.
It's all a matter of scale. For them, our existence might just be like a constant, irritating, high-pitched whine, so their reaction isn't personal malice. It's the inevitable systemic result of two different physical realities colliding. We see ourselves as victims of supernatural wrath, but maybe we're just suffering the symptoms of incompatibility.
And once you start talking about highly adapted observers who notice imbalance in coastal civilizations, well, the narrative immediately goes to the unavoidable historical connection, Atlantis.
Exactly. But when we connect this to the historical accounts, we have to throw out that modern romanticized utopia we always picture. Plato's original accounts weren't about a perfect society. They were about imbalance, hubris. Atlantis was a powerful coastal society that expanded too far. It assumed control over the sea instead of having a relationship with it. And the ocean, in that story, it wasn't angry. It was just corrective. It was restoring a dynamic equilibrium.
Which is essential for challenging our assumptions about evidence, right? Why do we expect to find neat, preserved buildings? The source reminds us that the ocean is the absolute worst place for long-term preservation. Salt dissolves bone. Pressure reduces structures to dust. Tectonic forces are constantly shifting the stage. Expecting to find a tidy, preserved city is it's scientifically unrealistic.
And if these deep adapted intelligences existed, the hybrid claims their role wouldn't have been to rule Atlantis or protect it from its own actions. Based on this whole narrative, they would have simply warned it. And warnings, historically, they don't stop a collapse. They only mark it. Atlantis wasn't taken by the sea. It was returned to its essential components.
So the core theory that this narrative proposes is that Atlantis destroyed itself through a refusal to listen, through arrogance, constant noise, this belief that the sea and nature could be mastered instead of respected. And even if you view this purely as a metaphor, the pattern it's deeply disturbing. Coastal civilizations disappear and the ocean is rarely evil, it's just correcting something that went too far. The observers in this context are just witnesses who have seen this story play out before.
And let's broaden this beyond just Atlantis for a second, because the idea of a catastrophic reset, it's pervasive. The Great Flood story, it repeats across totally unrelated cultures globally. From Gilgamesh to Norse myth to countless indigenous traditions, it points to a recurring pattern of global collapse and reset.
Some versions of the Atlantis story even mention a great war, a conflict not just between nations but between ideologies. Restraint versus domination, coexistence versus control. The source suggests the Atlantean ruler wanted to be a god, blurring those natural and necessary limits of human power. And that shifts the disaster from just a random geological event to a self-inflicted ideological collapse.
Which brings us back to that crucial distinction we talked about earlier, consequence versus punishment. Ancient stories, they frame collapse as divine punishment, and that lets humanity externalize the blame onto some angry god. But if we reframe it as natural consequence, you push environmental systems, technological systems, ecosystems too far until something gives, well, then the lesson becomes internalized. We break the system, so the system breaks us.
And this is supported by a really unsettling detail, something found consistently across ancient traditions: the abrupt drop in human lifespans after the flood or collapse. Humans who allegedly lived for hundreds of years suddenly lived much shorter spans, down to the 70 or 80 we know today.
Yeah, and that requires us to ask a really serious question. What if the flood wasn't just water? What if it was an environmental, maybe even an atmospheric collapse so severe that it permanently altered human survival? A collapse so total that it shifted the very biological possibility of longevity. So shorter lifespans, in this model, they wouldn't be a curse from an angry god. They would be a necessary physiological adaptation to a new, harsher, post-collapse world.
So the body it resets its maximum endurance to match the new reality. Reduced resources, increased environmental toxicity. It's an evolutionary downshift, a trauma response recorded right in our biology.
Exactly. It's like comparing the frantic data stream of a city street to the slow geological time of a mountain range. If civilization really does move in cycles, rise, arrogance, collapse, reset, then none of this is unprecedented. It's just forgotten. And if something has been watching that cycle from the patient deep, it sees us repeating the script. We're not writing a unique one. The sea becomes the archive that outlasts us all.
Okay, we need to ground this idea, this fascinating idea of the ocean as an archive and something tangible. So let's look at the account from the marine geologist mentioned in the source material. A total skeptic, a man who believed only in data, tectonic drift, and erosion rates.
His findings were genuinely anomalous. He was mapping an unusually stable shelf miles below the photic zone in an area of high tectonic stress. Geologically, that shelf should have collapsed and dissipated ages ago. Instead, it appeared not just stable, but almost ordered. maintained in a way nature usually isn't, but without any obvious giant structures like pyramids. It was an anomaly of preservation.
And then came the discovery of the trinkets. Small, scattered objects found across the deep sediment that, well, they defied all known material science. Non-metallic, non-stone, and crucially, they didn't corrode in the salt water. They were described as feeling subtly warm, almost charged, and were etched with these specific spirals following advanced mathematical ratios.
And the report mentions that the geometric precision of these spirals, it followed ratios like derivatives of the golden spiral, but far more complex, that actually made the sonar and deep-sea scanning equipment fluctuate, sometimes even crash. So the objects weren't just inert. They were actively interacting with modern sensing technology.
That's the detail that gives me chills. That level of interference, that precision. It suggests a technology far beyond just, some mineral formation. And this geologist, who was initially a total disbeliever, he found that these spiral patterns matched symbols found in pre-dynastic artifacts across totally different continents, Mesoamerica, India, the Mediterranean, suggesting a shared, incredibly ancient global origin, something predating all known recorded history.
The official conclusion, which came down from the higher-ups, was that these were anomalous mineral formations. But the geologist, he rejected this vehemently. Minerals don't appear in deliberately repeating, mathematically precise sets scattered across kilometers. His unwavering conclusion was that this was evidence of intent, of deliberate placement, not random formation.
He theorized that if a hyper-advanced culture fell suddenly, like Atlantis, what would survive isn't the grand architecture. That dissolves under pressure and salt. It's the small, personal, non-corroding objects. The trinkets, left behind by people who understood that collapse was inevitable. They used the deep ocean as a vault, not a grave. They stored their warnings where the surface noise couldn't destroy them.
And significantly, the scientist eventually stopped researching that shelf. He resigned, went quiet, because, as he put it, some data doesn't want to be extracted. And this shifts the entire narrative of Atlantis, doesn't it? It stops being a lost city we fail to find, and it becomes a lost decision. A conscious choice by a dying culture to mark a boundary and let the ocean keep what the surface could no longer responsibly hold.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Whether these claims from the alleged hybrid are literal truths or just brilliant metaphorical fiction, the distilled knowledge is clear. These stories are fundamentally about limits, about arrogance, about mistaking silence for absence. We keep looking for Atlantis as a fully constructed, finished city, a great ruin to uncover. But maybe it was always meant to dissolve and scatter, surviving only as myths and those strange, signal-jamming artifacts.
The core lesson here is cyclic. If civilization moves in predictable cycles, rise, arrogance, fall, reset, we are not approaching something new. We're approaching something familiar. The most dangerous moment isn't the collapse itself, it's the confidence. That moment, a civilization believes it's immune to the mistakes of the past, or that the silence of the deep means it has permission to dominate.
So if the ocean is a vault, if myths are compressed memories of trauma, and if those trinkets are warnings disguised as curiosities, are we advanced enough to break the cycle this time? Or are we only advanced enough to repeat it faster and louder? The real question isn't whether something lives in the deep, patiently waiting. It's whether we've learned anything from the last time the ocean decided to correct the story.